Hey there, folks. So welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, it's a big one. We're going to be talking about the newest album from Paramore called After Laughter. You know, I think I need someone to explain to me what the whole big hype is behind Paramore, because the more I've listened to their material and their albums, the less I'm really seeing it. Now, that's not saying they're a bad group, calm down. Their first three albums are a respectable slice of emo-leaning pop rock, with Riot probably being the best of them in my view, but even then I was never really wowed by the writing or the performances or the production. It's good music, sure, a couple great singles, but nothing I would actively seek out or that I thought stood out against the rest of the whole pop rock boom. There were better bands. Then there was that self-titled album in 2013 that I actually reviewed for a year-end anniversary in 2014, an album released after the lead guitarist and the drummer quit. And again, for mid-2010s pop rock released on Fueled by Ramen, it certainly checked off a lot of the boxes, but I did not understand all the critical acclaim that was being dumped on that album. There are a few catchy singles, sure, a couple good songs, and Hayley Williams' brand of colorful theatrics, they had their moments, helped by self-aware songwriting that was getting better. I can definitely respect that. But at the end of the day, I was lukewarm on the album at best, and I have not had any real inclination to revisit that record since. Don't get me wrong, it's decent, but I stand by the problems I called out in my review. So I wasn't remotely surprised when Paramore decided to pivot towards retro new wave indie pop for their newest album. Sure, their bassist was now also gone, but producer Justin Mendel-Johnsen was filling in, and they actually got their old drummer Zach Farrell back. Hell, I wasn't even all that surprised by the change in instrumental direction. Punk acts have gone new wave to stay relevant since the late 70s. This is not all that new or surprising. What did catch my attention was the emphasis on how trying and exhausting the recording session apparently was, and how much that struggle had translated into the rather dark themes that were contrasting with the brighter instrumentation. Again, this isn't anything that's all that new, but as a more polished spin on some of their emo-leaning lyrics in the past, it could make for an interesting or compelling listen, or at least a different one from their past discography. So how does After Laughter turn out? Well, honestly, this is one of those projects that where I can respect most of the thematic arc and a lot of the structure here, it's not exactly an album that sticks with me on the execution, which, yes, might as well be the tagline to any comments or reviews I've made on Paramore, but After Laughter is arguably the most straightforward album that they've ever assembled, and also, to some extent, their most honest, so this opinion comes out most clear here. The big question that comes most in whether or not that honesty was leveraged effectively and was used well, which is a much more complicated question, and we'll get into it. But otherwise, I think fans will like it, but I was only kind of lukewarm on it. And to start with that, we need to begin with Hayley Williams, who really is the reason that anyone cares about Paramore. Hardcore fans, calm down. Again, even if she doesn't want to admit it, it's definitely a sentiment that runs through the music industry, the vast majority of listeners, and a fair few disgruntled ex-bandmates, one over who sued over the issue, especially with regards to the songwriting. But the deeper truth is that she's arguably bringing the most to the table as a songwriter and a performer. The spiky guitar lines and drum grooves, they're solid, sure, but she's the front woman, she's the face of the band, and more than ever, this feels like her story and hers alone. And yet, longtime fans will undoubtedly pick up on how she's not exactly as vibrant or aggressive as she was in her rock days, which, yeah, is to be expected, but where she does seem to get a little bit more manic on this album, it bears a sign of instability as her voice is cracking, especially on Idol Worship. And credit to her, this album really puts her through the emotional paces, and yeah, she does deliver. Not exactly with a lot of subtlety here, but there is weariness and raw emotion in her delivery. Again, she's the reason why you're going to want to hear this album. And yeah, it's hard not to notice how much this record gains through carefully multi-tracked hooks on songs like Rose-Colored Boy, or Fake Happy, or especially Pool. It almost sounds like something out of a mid-2000s Hilary Duff album. And look, don't get upset here. This is coming from somebody who owns those albums, and I would consider that more of a feature than a flaw. It does feel a little bit odd against this production though, which is entirely embraced the mid-80s glossy new wave bounce full of bass lines, jittery guitar work, and drum work that's always on the edge of exploding but never quite hitting that point. And since it's a Justin Mendel-Johnsen production, it simultaneously throws in a fair number of quirky effects, synth tones, and elements that contribute to the melody but also can feel a little bit distracting to an otherwise solid chord in the composition, like the marimba on Hard Times, or the chime-like bells on Pool, or that fizzy synth on Caught in the Middle, or the inclusion of Aaron Weiss's rambling, self-referential, and yet buried vocals on No Friend that might have worked better for the rest of the album if they were supplementing Hayley Williams instead of replacing her. Seriously, she doesn't sing on that song. Or indeed, if you could hear most of what he's saying at all. But that's avoiding the real underlying issue for a lot of this production. Namely that for all this slick new wave style, it's not exactly colorful or full of the spark of energy that made Paramore's self-titled album at least stand out. And I'm convinced this is a conscious choice, because on the song that's celebrating the return of Zach Farrow on Grudges, there is a certain brightness that cuts through the kooky guitar layers. I actually really like that song. And sure, I'm not averse to the group doing their best Shura impression on Forgiveness. It is one of the best songs on this album. But again, like Hayley Williams' delivery, something can't help but feel a little bit off from what you would expect. A little desaturated and lacking in the same momentum, and certainly lacking any sort of rock explosiveness. And of course, if you dig into the lyrics, that was all very intentional, as the record makes it very plain that Hayley Williams is indeed going through what at least sounds like anxiety, and probably on some level it has manifested as depression. And in a neat parallel between the production and the content, despite getting more garish, it can't help but feel more and more like a pose in trying to put on this show. And on some level, I like that. It gives songs like the hesitant reconciliation of Forgiveness some real emotional weight, or snaps against the patronizing optimism of Rose-Colored Boy some real teeth to it, even though she's speaking to her husband, or the mingled blend of fear and insecurity that runs through idol worship as she confronts fans and tells them that she's the furthest thing from which they want to emulate, which paradoxically will likely make her even more beloved by that fan base, something that Aaron Weiss actually calls out on No Friend, as he plainly says how the band will market off this relatability even while he is grateful for the success, which is a level of cold cynicism that doesn't really gel with how earnest and vulnerable the rest of this album and Hayley Williams is trying to be. Now granted, sometimes that earnestness can bite Williams in the back, like on Fake Happy, which despite its self-awareness still is a song trying to call out people around her for faking happiness with a big sing-along chorus. I found 26 to be much more intriguing, intended as a message for her more cynical younger self who had advocated to stay grounded and real, whereas now she kind of wishes to hold on to those dreams given that she's at a low point right now. And sure, the composition can feel a little bit schmaltzy, but the sentiment, it does resonate. I like the flutes that came in on the outro. Where it doesn't really resonate is on the final song, Tell Me How, which mostly focus on the losses of bandmates and confusion to how she should really feel about it now, which mostly works as it hang that open question up until the outro, where she says that she knows those ex-bandmates are gonna be thinking about her, and she believes that there is something still there on their part. And I get that it's supposed to feel a little bit sweet, a moment of light at the end of the tunnel, but between the instrumental tone and the delivery, it feels like a magnanimous moment that doesn't quite match the tone of the rest of the writing. It didn't really fit with the song, which leads to my biggest issue with After Laughter. I get that a record tilting towards this side of new wave isn't expected to be as overwritten as most emo tends to be, and you can make the argument that Paramore never really inhabited that particular space entirely in their songwriting, but more than ever, the metaphors and the language here feel increasingly pedestrian and stale and flat. Told You So and Caught in the Middle are the most glaring cases, but more often than not, it feels reduced to a lower common denominator and more accessible, which, given how popular in indie pop a lot of the tones are on this album, especially towards the mainstream, it can feel kind of cynical and kind of undercut how personal this album is trying to be. I get plain spoken language, but this is going a little bit too far, but in a strange way, this album hasn't really changed my impression of Paramore. They're a good band anchored in a potent lead performer that can go for good ideals but kind of muddies the execution by catering to popular sounds and conventional lyrical tropes. They did a lot of this back in their 2000s era too, and they're doing it here. Which yeah, it makes for a good pop act, and I'm happy that they dropped the pretense that this is the furthest thing from rock music, but it's also not like I can point to a half dozen other new wave leaning acts right now in synth pop and pop rock that aren't doing this sound and are doing similar things better. And that's before we touch on the bands who have been taking the sound to more interesting places 30 years ago. As such, for me, I'm giving this a very strong 6 out of 10 and a recommendation for fans, but otherwise, again, I'm kind of lukewarm overall. I've definitely heard better, but yeah, there are good songs, and if you're curious, it's worth a listen. Check it out. So yeah, thanks so much for watching. Like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Paramore fans, just try to be relaxed here. Like, I wanted to like this. I heard there was a lot of good ideas going in, but it just didn't click with me. But if you want to buy the album, links in the description below, and I got the poll up there for all you to tell me how wrong I am. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get more involved in my Patreon, the link to that is right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my upcoming schedule, and once per week you guys get to add records or even movies to that schedule. More details right there, but until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.